Hopefully not too long a sermon today, but I'm going to try and squeeze in everything. I just want this to be the last week I preach on dating. I want to go on to the next topic. Kevin's going to be preaching the next 2 weeks after this week, and then the week after that will be the 13th, and then the 20th, and I'll be preaching again. So I'm just going to try and squeeze in the last two topics I wanted to talk about in regards to dating and courtship and sort of preparing for marriage. And the topics are going to be, principles for dating. What are some good principles to follow to go on dates and things like that for those of us who are looking for a spouse. And prerequisites for marriage. So what are the no-goes for marriage? So I'll try and breeze through this as quick as possible just because I've got a lot to go through. But just a couple of principles, and I'm not up here preaching as though I'm perfect, obviously, and I've said this a couple of times, but just reminding us all again, I'm not preaching from a point of view that I did all these perfectly, I didn't, but God's word says the same nevertheless, and I wanted to share these with you. So I'm not coming at a point of view that, I did everything right, because I definitely did not, but I think if you do the right things, I think it'll be a much more of a blessing to you. And if you know somebody that is dating, or for those of us who might have children in the future and they grow up, if we teach our children these principles, I'm sure they will have a more blessed dating experience and a blessed marriage if they keep these principles. But first and foremost, number one, I've got a couple of just principles for dating. And of course, as we always talked about, and I said when I started this series, that we need to renew our mind and get the right perspective. It's the same when we're going to date somebody. We need to have the right perspective. In 1 Corinthians 10, the Bible says, whether therefore ye eat or drink or whatsoever ye do, do all to the glory of God. So we need to have that perspective that in anything we do it for God's glory. We do it for the glory of God. We do it to serve God, even though we're serving another person. It's like when we serve in church. We're not just serving in church to the end that we are serving church. It's to the end that we're serving the Lord Jesus Christ, and that's why we serve in church. That's why we serve our spouse. That's why we submit to our husband, or that's why we protect and we love our wife. So it's the same when it comes to dating. When it comes to dating, you need to have that right perspective, because a lot of people will ask when they think about the topic of dating, is this the right person for me? And there's a right way and a wrong way to ask that question. The wrong way is, what is this person going to do for me? How is this person going to fulfill my life, fulfill my desires? A self-serving way to ask that question. But the right way to ask that question is, how is this person going to help me serve God? Is this person going to bring me closer to God? Is this relationship going to be a relationship that's pleasing to God and makes us serve God even more? Is this a person that I'm going to raise children with to serve the Lord? Or do they not have an interest in the Lord at all? And that plays a big part, obviously, in having a successful marriage. Yeah, you can have a happy marriage. It's easy to have a happy marriage as long as you both, have the same interests. But it's not so easy to have a marriage that serves God and puts God first, because that means both of you have to be committed to serving God and not serving yourself. So are you looking for someone to serve you and fulfill your desires, or someone that will serve God with you? So there's a right way and a wrong way to ask that question. Just go to a couple of verses quickly here. Matthew 4:10. Then saith Jesus unto him, this is Jesus being tempted in the garden by Satan. He says, Get thee hence, Satan, for it is written, Thou shalt worship the Lord thy God, and him only shalt thou serve. So again, you say, well, we serve other people too, but we serve other people because we're serving God. So God, at the end of the day, is the only one we are meant to serve. So when you ask that question, you've got to think, who will best serve God? Who will best serve God with you? Who will best cause you to serve God? Who wants to have children and raise them for God when you're looking at dating? And of course, for us who are married, we're not dating anymore. This is still what you want to strive for, in your marriage. It's the same goal. So put God first. Let's look at Philippians 4 here. Philippians 4, verse 4. I won't read it all. I wanted to read a couple of verses here, but the key verse I just wanted to show you here, it says, Rejoice in the Lord always, and again I say, rejoice. And you might be thinking, well, what does this verse have to do with having the right perspective? Well, the last thing I just wanted to say in having the right perspective is, don't turn dating and marriage into an idol. Because a lot of young people will, right? They turn marriage and dating into an idol where if it doesn't work out with this person, then they're just distraught. Their joy is gone. They get out of church, or the person that they're dating or they're married to, that's all they think about, and they're infatuated with them, and they'll go out of their way to serve that person. And then you have to ask the question: have you created an idol? If something doesn't work out in your life to the point where you lose your joy, you get out of church, you're not serving God anymore, you got to think, did I put that person in the place of God? Because shouldn't God be the one that you're thinking about day and night and meditating on, not this person? Will you go out of your way as much for that person, or will you go out of your way to serve God as much as you will for that person? You're dating a girl. For us guys probably know this. You're dating a girl. She calls you. She needs something done. You go and do it. No questions asked, right? You need to pick her up from work and take her home. No questions asked. Will you do the same for God? When God says to do something, will you just do it? No questions asked? Do you know what I mean? So we have to have this right perspective that we put God first. Don't create an idol. And I just thought of that verse because the Bible says to rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say rejoice, not rejoice in a man or a woman. So that's the first point. Have the right perspective when you're dating. Second point is John 15. Second point is be realistic. Be realistic. And what do I mean by be realistic? Is be biblical, right? Because the Bible is the truth. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. So be realistic. And I just thought of this verse here just to share this point. 1 John 2:15 says, love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and the pride of life is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world passeth away and the lust thereof, but he that doeth the will of God abideth forever. So the reason why I'm turning to this verse is, when we talk about being realistic, being biblical, often the reason why we're not realistic and we're not biblical is because we've been watching too much Hollywood, right? We've been watching too much drama. We've been reading too many romantic novels or whatever, and we have this skewed view of what relationship really is, what marriage really is, what romance really is. And, not saying that, all the stuff that we see on the movies and in Hollywood is necessarily fake, because it comes from something, right? It's just that it's a skewed view of what life should be. In Hollywood, there are certain themes that make the flesh tick. The romance, the passion, the lust, and that's what you're going to see because that's what sells, right? So if that's the only place you're getting that perspective, you're going to have this skewed view that is this what marriage all should be, and this is how it should be like, because I saw Brad Pitt do it, right? I saw this movie star do it. And if you expect that from your wife or your husband, you're not going to be realistic. You're getting a skewed view on the reality of marriage. If you want the reality, it's in Ephesians 5. We're not going to turn there, but we went through that last week. So Hollywood is not what you're striving for. And what we see in Hollywood about relationships and marriage, it's not what you're striving for because it's fake. It's often a biased and skewed view of life. And, like the Bible says here, the world, it's the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. And that's what sells. Because spirituality takes effort to walk in, right? But it doesn't take any effort at all to follow your flesh. That's why marketing, it's all about appealing to the flesh, appealing to covetousness, appealing to the pride of life, the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh. So it emphasizes the fleshly side of relationships, is what you see in movies and in drama. And a couple of just examples I have here is, one, for example, is, you don't have to always eat at the most expensive places. When you take somebody out to eat, for a guy, you don't have to take her to the most fanciest restaurant every single time and blow $150, $200 every time you go dating. You know what I mean? And for ladies, you shouldn't expect that. Don't expect a guy to just blow all his hard-earned money just going out and eating, fulfilling the lust of the flesh. If he takes you somewhere a bit more, low-key, you shouldn't be like, oh, this guy's a cheapskate. Is that what you're there for? Are you dating just to get the food? I thought you're there to talk to the guy. Does it matter where you are, what you're eating? So just things like that where people get this we go on a date and it's candlelit dinner and we've got table service and it costs $300. You know, to some people, $300 might not be a lot of money, but I think to most of us, that's a lot of money. And I don't know, it's not necessarily wrong to do. I'm just saying the expectation. You know, be realistic, be biblical in your expectations. That's one example. You know, another is, you know, don't expect to be just showered with gifts. You know, some girls just expect, you know, this guy's dating me and showering me with gifts and expecting that, as opposed to going into dating, you know, being serving, right? And thinking about what God would want and thinking about, is this relationship going to work and going to please God? I just want to show you this. I touched on it a couple of weeks ago, but Elizabeth, she saved this picture, but she forgot to share it with me. But just this idea, you know, we talk about realistic expectations, you know, we talk about the soulmate and, you know, this one person for me. So, you know, if you go in with that wrong expectation, you might be disappointed. And, you know, you see these things on Facebook. You know, imagine a man so focused on God that the only reason he looked up to see you is because he heard God say, "That's her." And, you know, it sounds great, right? And you get a warm, fuzzy feeling when you see this on Facebook. But is that true? That's not true. Do you know what I mean? Like, God never said to me, and this is what I'm going to talk about today, and God never said to me, you know, "That's her." You know, so, you know, we over-spiritualize things and they sound good, but they're not true. And this is why I'm saying, you know, be realistic, be biblical, not have this idea that we got from Hollywood and movies. You know, this idea that there's just this one perfect person for you and there's nobody else. And, you know, even to the point where people don't even want that other person liking another person. It's like if that person had dated somebody else before or liked somebody else before, it's like ruined it for them, because it's like, I want to be the only one that they ever liked and they ever got with. And, you know, this idea, it's not realistic. You know, it reminds me of Asian movies. If you've ever watched like Asian romance movies, the story is always very similar. You know, there's one guy and he's after this girl, and you know they're like, you know, childhood sweethearts, and this girl, she really likes this guy, but when he works up the courage to go and approach this girl, she's already with somebody else, and it's like the opportunity's missed. And then when she breaks up with that guy, and then she thinks, oh, okay, I'm going to go talk to him, and now he's with somebody else. It's like that opportunity's always missed. And then when they're finally both single, right? And then they have this chance to get together, one of them dies in a car crash or something like that. It's just like, oh, it's never meant to be. It's like this tragic ending. Somebody always dies in an Asian movie. At the end, always somebody dies, either the lady or the man. I've seen movies where both of them die at the end. Like, it's like they both died. It's just, nobody can ever have them. Yes. So this unrealistic expectation, you know, you're not always going to be the only one, only crush, you know, that they had, their only choice, and that's all right. If you don't expect it, you're not going to be disappointed. You know, it's like ladies, you know, like if a guy asks your friend out and that doesn't work out, and then you sort of have a bad feeling because now he's asking you out, and you feel like your second choice. So it's just this expectation, you know, not all of us were the first choice, and that's fine. You know, a friend at work was saying, because we were talking about applying for work and getting rejected from a job and all that sort of stuff, and even the job I'm doing now, like I wasn't the first pick. Like, you know, like the person that actually got the role decided not to take it, so then they offered it to me. And the boss came to me and said, you know, do you still want the job? And I said, well, of course. You know, I applied for it, didn't I? I don't care if I'm first or second pick. Like, you know, if I wanted it, I'm going to take it. And it's just funny because she was sort of explaining to me, you know, because a lot of people aren't like that. They think, you know, if they're not the first pick and then they're then offered the job, they won't take it just out of pride. I just think how silly that is. And isn't that the same with dating, right? Are you going to give up that opportunity? I mean, this could be the person that you have a blessed marriage together, you serve God together. Are you going to give that up just because you weren't the first pick? Does it matter? You know what I mean? And anyways, well, I was talking about this with another guy at work and explaining what happened. And he's like, yeah, because those of us who are realistic, we're like, who cares if you're not the first? You got the job. And we were talking about relationships, and he says, you know, he says this to girls all the time, you know, he wasn't the first pick, Brad Pitt was the first pick, but she couldn't have Brad Pitt, so that's why she got you. Something like that. So, you know, don't be hard on guys if he's asked your best friend on a date also. And, you know, dating isn't just all glitz and glamour, you know, because in real life, you know, people work. You know what I mean? Like in sitcoms, nobody works. They just have time to hang out all the time. That is not real. So, you know, you might have these worldly desires. You know, you might have this impression of how dating should be because you watch too many movies, because you watch too many dramas. And I'm not up here saying that necessarily watching movies are wrong, because obviously, you know, this is a movie. Is that wrong? So you can't take the position that movies and even a television is wrong, because a lot of people say it's a sin to have a television in your house. And you say, Victor, you don't have a television in your house. Well, that's because I don't think there's anything worthwhile on television to watch, so there's no point having a television in my house. But in a sense, I wouldn't say that I don't have a television in my house, because this is a television nowadays, right? You just get Netflix and your computer becomes a television. So it's funny often that people say, get that television out of your house. It's a sin to have a television in your house. And yet they've got 5 computers and they have Netflix. So, you don't want to be pharisaical about the rules that you set. But definitely a lot that is on television and a lot that is in the movies is not good. I think you'd be hard pressed to find a Hollywood movie that is worth watching. So, that's why it's important to get in church. That's why it's important to make friends here. Try and break out of your groups and get to know one another. That's why I definitely encourage everyone to stay up after for lunch, get to know some people. But the best way to get to know people in this church, and for those of us who are regulars here, you go soul winning with somebody, you get to know them really well. So, that's our ministry in this church. You go along soul winning, you start off as a silent partner, and you'll get to know people in this church as you go with different people soul winning. That's the best way to make friends. And that's how you're going to change. That's how you're going to affect change in your life. You're probably thinking, it's so hard sometimes to change my desires, to change how I live. And often it's because what you're filling your mind with, the friends that you're hanging around. Sometimes it's hard to change habits in your life if you're hanging around people that constantly have these habits. I had this conversation with somebody recently where they were just saying, it's just so hard, to just fall into materialism again, and it's hard to do what's right, and it's hard to do, the right thing. And I said to them, well, how high is God's priority on your list? How high is church on your list? How high is making friends with people in church on your list? Because if you were in a good church, if you're in a church that believed the right thing, that had realistic expectations, that wasn't materialistic, didn't just talk about, how much money to make and career and blah, 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 that's probably not what you would care about either. And that's why, in this church, it's funny because, we don't really glorify women that have college degrees and things like that. We glorify women that want to become mothers and women that have children, and women that want to strive for God's pattern of what a woman should strive to be. So women that want to follow that, they're comfortable in this church because this is what we like. This is what the Bible wants a woman to be. So who you hang around is going to change how easy it is for you to walk in the Spirit. So if you're struggling to walk in the Spirit, get around other people that are trying to walk in the Spirit, and you'll walk in the Spirit a lot easier. So, I can't say that watching Hollywood movies, because I'm sure there's a Hollywood movie out there that maybe is good. I don't know. You'd probably be hard pressed to find it. But what I find mind-boggling is how Christians justify watching some of the movies that are out there. Because any movie that's out there that I know of, even if it seems like it's something that's not so bad, will have something bad in it. And you watch this movie, and maybe it's Batman or whatever. You watch this movie, and that immodest scene will always come up. Either it's 2 people fornicating, or it's a lady that's dressed immodestly. And even when I was unsaved, that was an uncomfortable moment. Was it for you guys as well? I just remember watching movies with friends, and that immodest scene comes up, and it was so weird because it's like we're watching porno together. And so it was uncomfortable even when I was not saved. So it's like that weird moment that comes up when you're watching a movie with friends, and it's inappropriate. There are people acting married when they're not. There are godless themes like evolution, godless families, right? Where dad's an idiot, mum knows what's going on, mum's the boss of the house, things like that are being promoted. There's foul language, crude jokes. So you know what? If you're going to watch these Hollywood worldly movies that have this smut in them and this sin in them, it's don't at least don't advertise it to the world. Some Christians, they'll say, they put on Facebook, I was just at Hoyt's Cinema watching this movie. I mean, if you're going to go and watch these Hollywood movies, at least keep it a secret, and not publish it to the world. Don't be a Jonah and get everyone involved in your sin. But don't promote it with your finances. as well, because every time you go watch a movie, you're promoting that movie. The more people go and pay to see that movie, the more they're going to create those sort of movies. So why don't you, use your money to support a church or support things like this? Because if we support things like this with our money, more documentaries like this will be made, and it's something more of value. So be realistic with your expectations. Don't get your expectations from the world and what do we mean by world? The lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. So that's number 2. Number 3. Number 3 is to treat each other with all purity. And this is probably the major one when it comes to dating, because it's all about trying to do it in a way so that you don't fornicate, right? Fornicate meaning, you sleep together before you're married. And, I would say fornication also includes, inappropriate touching and hugging, anything that, it leads towards that act, right? Because I don't think, and I'll touch on this in another sermon, but fornication, I don't believe, is only sex outside of marriage, right? It is any type of sexual immorality. I don't think it's justified as sex outside of marriage. So, when it comes to fornication, because some people will say well, we didn't penetrate, right? But we're doing all this other stuff. You're still fornicating, right? Because you're doing things that only a husband and wife should do. So if you want to do those things, just get married and then it's fine. Look at what the Bible says here. Now concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife and let every woman have her own husband. So this verse is not teaching that men should never ever touch a girl, meaning you can't shake hands, you can't pat a girl on the back. She's drowning and it's no, can't touch a woman. You're going to jump in and save her, right? And you may have to grab her in order to save her. So, obviously in verse 2, it's clear that it's talking about fornication, because it says it's good for a man not to touch a woman, nevertheless to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife and let every woman have her own husband. So there are certain things that you should only do to your wife that you shouldn't do to any other woman. But we should always err on the side of caution if we can. It's just better to not do the hugging and kissing and touching if you're not married to that woman. 1 Timothy 5. And here's another verse, 1 Timothy 5 says, rebuke not an elder. And I'm coming at this from more of a guy's point of view for now, and then I'll talk about girls in a second. It says, rebuke not an elder, but entreat him as a father, and the younger men as brethren. So you can see the context here is talking about how we treat family, as we should treat church as a family. And I actually don't think, this doesn't mean that you can never rebuke me, right? It's not saying rebuke not an elder, meaning don't ever rebuke a bishop. It's saying, in the context, it's talking about family. It's just saying you should never rebuke a man that's older than you, but entreat him as a father. Just anybody that's older than you. Or the way you should, I guess, rebuke in a sense is entreat him as a father. And the young men as brethren, the older women as mothers, the younger as sisters with all purity. So when it comes to guys, how they should treat girls when they're dating them is they should treat them like their sister. Do you know what I mean? So you might say, well, me and my sister, we do hug and we do wrestle and we do things like that. I don't even think, brothers and sisters should do those things, because we hear about all the stories, of siblings inappropriately touching each other. You read about the Duggar family, about things that happen like that. I think what we can learn from that is just because siblings are brother and sister doesn't mean that we then just negate how they should behave toward one another, right? Just because she's your sister doesn't mean, you can just, fondle her just like, you wouldn't to somebody else, but just because she's your sister doesn't mean you can do things that are inappropriate to her. So we treat women as we would treat our sisters. So, when it comes to men that are dating, don't have this ungodly attitude of how much I can get from this girl. How much of her purity I can take. That's such a wicked and ungodly attitude for guys to do those sorts of things. You ought to treat this woman, how would you want your sister treated? This is what this verse is teaching. Treating them as sisters with all purity. How would you want another guy treating your sister? And better yet, if you had a daughter, how would you want a guy treating your daughter? right? Would you want the guy doing to your daughter what you are doing to that girl? You know, even if it's not just touching, what about emotionally leading her on? You know, stringing her along and breaking her heart? You want a guy to do that to your daughter? I wouldn't want a guy doing that to my daughter, so why would I do that to another girl? We need to treat women with all purity, and it's not just physical purity. I believe we should try our best to preserve their emotional purity as well. So that's a good way to think of that. You know, do unto others as you would have done unto you. Like, would I want my daughter treated that way? Would I want my sister treated that way? If not, don't treat another lady that way. What about from a woman's point of view? I was going to go to Proverbs 6, but just for sake of time, I'll just go to Proverbs 7 only. We'll just read a couple of verses here. And this proverb really is about the strange woman, and we'll read a bit about her in Proverbs 7. Say unto wisdom, thou art my sister, and call understanding thy kinswoman, that they may keep thee from the strange woman, from the stranger which flattereth with her words. For at the window of my house I looked through my casement, and behold, among the simple ones I discerned among the youths a young man void of understanding, passing through the street near her corner. And he went the way to her house in the twilight, in the evening, in the black and dark of night. And behold, there met him a woman with the attire of an harlot. So a harlot is a prostitute. Attire is clothing. So the clothing of a prostitute. And subtle of heart. She is loud and stubborn. Her feet abide not in her house. And I won't read the rest, but we get a good picture of what this strange woman is like. You know, she's there lurking to try and allure the simple-minded man that is, obviously just following his lusts, which most of us do. You know, she dresses in a certain way and she behaves a certain way, and we read that in Proverbs 7. So just like a man should treat the girls with all purity, women have a part to play too, right? Women have a part to play, meaning, you know, you are not acting like this strange woman. You're not dressing like this strange woman in order to preserve the purity of the guy that you're dating, right? So there are two parts to play. And it's always like this, you know, when you hear about domestic, you hear about, rape cases and things like that, and everyone starts to jump on either side of the fence, right, and say, oh, the guys, you have those, who are those activist ladies that walk around naked and they're still saying, yeah, it's still not permission for you to rape me, right? And then you've got the men saying, well, if you would just put on some clothes, a guy wouldn't rape you. And I remember reading on Facebook recently this quote from the imam from a Lakemba mosque saying, when you put meat out on the counter uncovered, the flies are going to come eat it, so that's why you've got to cover the meat and put on the niqab or whatever. So he's got the other side of the coin where it's like it's the woman's fault. But then the right perspective is it's both their fault. They won't let you have that position where, you play the devil's advocate. You say, oh, it's man's fault or it's woman's fault. No, it's both their fault. Because if a woman wasn't in the wrong place, wasn't dressed the wrong way, yes, she wouldn't have got raped. But that doesn't excuse the guy, because the guy should be treating the girl with all purity, right? As sisters with all purity. So they're both wrong in most cases, I think. But yeah, obviously in some cases it's just a man just raping a woman, or I'd say the man obviously is in more of the wrong. What was I going to say? Yeah, so Proverbs 7, we read about the strange woman. And, at one point I just wanted to bring up here is, when it comes to ladies' social media profile and photos that you put on the internet, when a man looks at those photos, will he get this picture? Do you know what I mean? Like when a man looks at your profile picture and he looks at the pictures that you put on Facebook and you post on Facebook for all the world to see, is he thinking of this? Is he thinking of the strange woman that has the attire of an harlot? Do you know what I mean? So you got to think about what's my testimony? How am I showing myself to the world? And if you have pictures like that on Facebook, I think you should change them, or remove them. Don't keep them up there. What would a man think when he looks at your social media profile? Does he think of Proverbs 7? This is why I believe young women, this is why they need input from a father. Right? Because your best buddies, your best boy buddies, they're not going to tell you that take that photo down. They're going to like the photo. They're going to share the photo because they don't care about your purity. They're liking and subscribing to your feed because you're putting pornography on their feed. Do you know what I mean? So, girls put these photos up on Facebook and then, oh, look, I get all the likes and I get all the shares. Yes, because you're putting inappropriate photos of yourself up there. It reminds me of those YouTube channels where they have like 2 million or 3 million subscribers and you're like, what's this channel about? Oh, it's a lady teaching people how to breastfeed. No wonder she's got like 3 million followers. Or, a lady where she's obviously inappropriately dressed and you just think, are they really subscribing to your channel because of what you have to say? Or are they subscribing to your channel because of how you present yourself? So think about how you present yourself, and it's the same with dating, right? You think about how you present yourself so that you protect the purity of the guy that you are dating. Ezekiel 16. Let me show you this verse. Ezekiel 16, God is using the analogy of an imperious, whorish woman to describe the nation of Israel and Judah. But look at verse 30. It says, "How weak is thine heart, saith the Lord God, seeing thou doest all these things," all this fornication that he's been talking about in this chapter, "the work of an imperious, whorish woman, in that thou buildest thine eminent place in the head of every way, and makest thine high place in every street, and hast not been as an harlot, in that thou scornest high." So he's saying a prostitute at least gets paid, but he's saying here, you're not like a prostitute because you don't even want to get paid. "But as a wife that committeth adultery, which taketh strangers instead of her husband." So a prostitute is somebody that obviously sleeps with a man for money. But I would submit to you today, how is that different? I mean, obviously it's not exactly the same. But is it much different if a guy's going to wine and dine you and then you sleep with him? Do you know what I mean? Are you not just a different type of prostitute? I mean, he's going to buy you a gift and therefore you're going to sleep with him? He's going to take you out for dinner and therefore you sleep with him? I mean, the prostitute is just smarter because she's taking the cash. Like the Bible's saying, she's got the cash, she can buy whatever she wants. Whereas you have to take whatever the guy offers you, right? So, get that perspective. Is it any different if you're willing to sleep with a guy just because he takes you out a couple of times and treats you nicely? Isn't that what a prostitute is doing? She's just getting something and then giving him something, as opposed to committing to one another and then having that physical relationship together. All right, let's go to 1 Corinthians 10. Now, when it comes to treating each other with all purity, I think it's a good principle is to always err on the side of caution, because it is a grey line, right? It's like, not touching a woman. Where's that line? I know I heard before, if you wouldn't do it with a man, don't do it with a woman. That's a good measure, I'd say. But these are grey lines. Like, these are not commandments, because it doesn't say that in the Bible, right? It just says, nevertheless, to avoid fornication. It says it's better to not touch a woman. Where you draw that line, it takes a bit of wisdom, doesn't it? It takes a bit of self-control. So I think when it comes to trying to determine that line, like in everything in life, when we talk about modesty even, how modest is modest? Well, you shouldn't be having the frame of mind of how immodest can I get before I'm not modest anymore. It should be, how modest can I be? It's the same with purity. We should err on the side of caution. How pure can I keep this relationship? What should I do in order to keep it as pure as possible? So we ought to err on the side of caution. 1 Corinthians 10 verse 12 says, "Wherefore let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall." So let's be wise about how we can fall. 1 Corinthians 6:15 says here in verse 18, it says, "Flee fornication. Every sin that a man doeth is without the body, but he that committeth fornication sinneth against his own body." So this doesn't just say don't commit fornication, it says flee from it. Because it's not how close should I get to the line before I tempt myself. It's let's get as far away from the line as possible so that temptation is not even in the question, not even in the picture. Ecclesiastes 3. Just breeze through a couple of these verses. It says here in verse 5, "A time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing." So I think that's a good principle for dating. There is a time to embrace, that's once you're married. And there's a time to refrain from embracing, and that's when you are dating and when you're still single. So, my recommendation there is, err on the side of caution. and get married sooner, because, long relationships, long engagements are dangerous because there's a higher temptation to fornicate and to do things that are not appropriate. So get married sooner. Now the question came up is, one question is, what about groups and chaperones? That's a big thing when it comes to Christian dating. They say you should always have a chaperone. I mean, whether you call it a chaperone or whether you call it groups, it's just basically hanging out with the prospective person with other people, right? Or should you do that alone? Well, my opinion there is, I think it is good to spend some time alone, generally probably in the earlier part, because there are some things that you might want to talk about that you don't necessarily want everyone there talking about. And that's why I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing to start off dating alone, because generally at the beginning there's less of a temptation, right? Because you don't know each other so well. Most people are not going to jump into the sack the first night if they have some respect for themselves. So I think that those first couple of dates, if you do them the right way, there won't be that temptation, and you can talk about what most people would call the D&Ms, right? The deep and meaningfuls. So I think once you have a couple of those D&Ms and you have the deep and meaningfuls and you talk about a lot of things I'm going to talk about later on, is then probably once you get to know each other and you're sort of thinking, yes, this does work out, we're going to get married, it's probably best from then on to stick with groups, right? So that you're not tempted to do things that you shouldn't. I would recommend that even if you're going somewhere with a group, to go separately. Go with your friends rather than go together, because there's always that time where you're driving home together late at night. It's dark. It's not safe. All right, in terms of purity. So err on the side of caution. I don't think it's necessarily wrong to have some alone dates to talk about the things that are important. But I think especially if you're engaged or you know that you're going to get married, then I think it's a good idea to spend most of your time together in groups. So the other thing as well is you might want to let your parents know where you are. Stay accountable. So keep parents informed about where you are and what you're doing, because if other people know what you're doing, you're less likely to do things that you shouldn't be doing. What time you're going to get home. So there's some accountability there. Last one is, what about day or night? I won't turn to the verses just for sake of time, but we know in the Bible, darkness is generally associated with sin, right? And light is associated with righteousness. And we know, this is why when you go to the nightclubs and those things, it's always at night, it's always dark, because people want to get away with doing things at night. There's less people around, it's less visible, so there's a higher temptation there to do things that are wrong. So I guess when it comes to dating, my recommendation would be it's better to date during the day. If you can meet on a Saturday afternoon, or I guess Saturday afternoon for most of us, that's really it. When the sun is up. I know it doesn't fit everyone's schedule. I mean, if you have to date at night, I'm not saying it's a sin to date at night. I'm just saying if you can keep it during the day, it's a lot better, because in the day, there's more people around. When you're in the car together, there's people around. People can see what you're doing in the car. And just generally, it'll be safer, I think. So better to date during the day than at night, in my opinion. So that's number 3. Treat each other with all purity. Now, a question came up saying, is it okay to date multiple women at the same time? Now, I guess technically it is. It is fine, because you don't really have anything together. We covered this a couple of weeks ago. I mean, there is really no relationship between you. The fact that you're just having a coffee together doesn't mean that you need to be exclusive. I think it's more a question of is it wise to date multiple women at the same time? And I guess I would question a guy, why would you date multiple women at one time? Because if you're deciding this is the girl you're going to go for, number one, are you really serious about that girl? If you're dating 3 or 4 women at the same time, like seriously, meaning you're seeing them frequently as well as this one person. And the other thing is, how are you convincing her that you're committed to her when you're keeping your options open with like 3 or 4 other girls? So I just think it would be a harder sell for the girl that you're trying to marry if you're doing that. But I don't think it's necessarily issue is how many girls you're dating or how often you're dating girls. I think it's more an issue of how you're treating the girls. if you're treating them with respect and you're not stringing them along and you're not like leading them on to something that you're not really interested in, then I don't think it's a problem necessarily if you're seeing a few girls and just having a couple of dates. But if you're seeing them frequently and it's more serious, then I would question your motives. And again, I just think apply the golden rule, right? Anything that you'd want done to somebody else, do to you. Would you want your sister or your daughter treated the way that you're treating this woman? And how do you look? Think about your perception. And I'm not saying that we should live to satisfy other people's perceptions, but how does it look when it's meeting this girl on Monday and this girl on Tuesday and this girl on Wednesday? So just think about your testimony there. Hope that answers that question. Now, number 4, and this is my second last topic. Let's go to Amos 3:3. And this is one of my favorite verses when it comes to relationships and just marriage and just any relationships really, because I think it's all about communication. Because we are not God, right? We can't read each other's hearts. We can't know what each other is thinking. And women, I think, are especially guilty of this because they just expect their husband to know what they're thinking, and they get upset when they don't know what they're thinking, right? And it's just about having, like I said, realistic expectations, right? Biblical expectations. Can you really expect that from your husband? If you're not willing to open up and tell him what the problem is he just meant to be a mind reader? And it works both ways. So it says here, can two walk together except they be agreed? And, it's a, what's the word I'm looking for? It's like a question you ask, but you're not expecting an answer. Rhetorical? Yeah, it's a rhetorical question because the answer is no when we read the chapter, that you cannot walk together unless you're agreed. So in the context of dating and finding a spouse, this is really important. Open and proactive communication is very important. Open meaning that you're not hiding things from each other. You're trying to talk and trying to learn one another. Proactive meaning that you proactively bring things up as opposed to waiting for the other person to bring it up or waiting for the other person to ask you the question. If there's something that you're concerned about or something that you want to talk about, bring it up. And if the person can't handle what you're bringing up, you just kind of think, are they really serious about this? Are they serious about having a successful relationship if they don't want to discuss the issues surrounding a relationship? Do you know what I mean? So bring these things up and talk about them. Now, especially when it comes to dating, I think talking is very important because there's only really 2 ways a dating relationship can progress, right? It can progress philosophically, which is through talking, or it can progress emotionally and physically, can't it? And the problem is if you are dating somebody and you're spending a lot of time with them and you are not discussing things openly and proactively, chances are what is progressing is the emotional and the physical side. And what you want to do with dating is you want the philosophical side to progress faster than the emotional and physical side. Because if you don't get along philosophically, then you can end it and not have the heartbreak that is usually associated with dating. So especially for guys, I think as guys should be the leader in any dating relationship, you ought to take the lead and you ought to spark conversation and bring up things and talk about it. It's the same when you're married. Like if you know something is bothering your wife, I think it's up to you, man, to deal with it and bring it up and talk with her, because women, I don't believe it's necessarily their responsibility to make sure that relationship is going well. They do play a part, but I think if it's not going well, the man has to step up and fix it. So talk and move the relationship forward philosophically rather than emotionally. I think someone that's serious will appreciate it. And because, lust is blinding, isn't it? Like if you're so invested emotionally and physically, you're going to overlook a lot of the philosophical differences that are much more important when it comes to having a successful marriage. So I've listed just some ideas here, and I'll just read them to you. Some ideas of things to talk about, and they're not necessarily listed in order of importance, but some of the things that Elizabeth and I talked about before we got married. We talked about religious beliefs, our religious views and doctrines, and that's like the major one, right? Because generally everything we believe stems from our religious view. So you talk about everything to do with that, a lot of doctrine, eternal security, salvation, everything, right? Whatever you want to talk about. Church, what church you want to be a part of. and what sort of church you want to go to. Your family, siblings, things like that. Future family plans about children. Gender roles, what you believe a husband should do, what you believe a wife should do, what you believe a father and a mother should do. Gender roles. Clothing standards. Is there a way that you expect your wife to dress? It's something good to talk about when you're dating. And obviously some of these topics are a bit heavier than others. So I'm not saying you just drop the bomb on the very first date. But, as you get to know one another, it just takes a bit of wisdom. As you get to know each other and the guards start coming down, you start talking about things that are more personal, more in depth. But you want to at least cover all these things before you make the decision to get married. Children, when you want to have children, how many children you want to have, how you plan to educate them or school them, how you plan to discipline them. Because this is often a cause of strife in families. One parent wants to spank and one parent believes in timeouts, and then there's like strife there, and then children play parents one against the other. So you need to be on the same page there. I listed church twice. That's how important it is. I listed it twice. Church. Past relationships. That's important too. Past relationships. Be open about that. Things that you've done in the past, mistakes that you've done in the past. Whether or not you're pure or not, I think are very important. Past relationships, struggles that you struggle with, what if scenarios. This is some of the things that Elizabeth and I talked about. What if I became a cripple? How would you handle that? Would you leave me? What if I became mentally incapacitated? What if I died? What would you do? Should you marry somebody else? I tell Elizabeth, if I die, marry somebody else. So that somebody can take care of you. What if situations? What if I'm unfaithful? There are different views on that, and I'll talk about that at another sermon. But what if I've been unfaithful? How would you handle it? What would you do? What if scenarios, I think, are good things to talk about. Finances. Should you have the same bank account? Should you share bank accounts? Should you have separate bank accounts? How are you going to run the money when you're married? Work. Do you want your wife to work or not? Or is she going to quit work once you get married? Or is she going to quit work once you have your first child? Or things like that. Goals that you have in life. What do you want to achieve in life? Is the woman willing to give up some goals in order to follow the goals of the man? Where you want to live. Is your wife going to take on your surname? Is that important to you? Is she going to have it hyphenated, or is she going to keep her maiden name? This is important to some people. It's important to me. I think it's biblical for a woman to be called by the name of the husband. Wife's surname. Social media and emails. I know some couples, once they get married, they have shared email accounts, shared social media accounts. Discuss these things. These might seem small, but if they're small, then talk about them. Then that way, if they're small, there's no point having strife about them once you're married, if you've discussed them beforehand. And anything in your background. So there are some ideas. It's not an all-inclusive list. But that to give you an idea of what I mean when I say talk about things. I mean talk about things. Talk about everything. Bring them up and talk about them. And I don't recommend keeping secrets from the person that you're going to marry. I don't necessarily think that nullifies your vow. Like if you haven't told them something, and there are things that I've found out about Elizabeth after we've been married. Depending on the seriousness of the issue. I mean, if the issue is really serious, then it's probably better that you bring it up before you're married. It may not necessarily mean you're not married after you get married, but it just means that your relationship might not start off on the right foot. I mean, let's say, you're married for like a couple of months, and then something that was very important to you gets brought up, and you're like, why didn't you tell me before we got married? And you just feel like, what else are you keeping from me? So this is why it's all about being proactive and being open with communication, because it's very hard to build trust, isn't it? But it's very easy to lose it. And that's why with communication, when something like that happens, you want your marriage and your relationship to be really strong, and that's why you don't want to keep things from one another. Now, the one exception, I think, when it comes to nullifying your marriage, and this is just a thought that I just wanted to share with you. I do think, actually, if you are impure and you get married, under the pretense that you are pure, I do believe that the Bible does give grounds to break that marriage, because in Deuteronomy 22, it talks about a virgin not being pure, and she's married under the pretense that she is pure, and if she's found to not be pure, she's stoned to death. So I would say in our day and age, if a woman is stoned to death for something that she's done, and it sounds like that is the case, to me, that would be grounds to break that relationship. But whether that applies to the man or not, if a man marries, I don't know what man would do this, but if he marries under the pretense that he's a virgin and is not, Can the woman put away her husband? I haven't decided there, but something that happy for you guys to discuss. But that's Deuteronomy 22, and it talks about the virgin being married, and then the guy says, I came into this woman and found her not a maid, and then they have to spread the cloth, which I think is, my wife tells me that it might be a cloth because when a woman loses her virginity, she can bleed, and that cloth can show she was a virgin on the night she got married. So just a thought there. So talk about everything. I think it's very important. 1 Peter 5 says here, likewise, ye younger, submit yourselves unto the elder. Yea, all of you be subject one to another, and be clothed with humility. For God resisteth the proud, and giveth grace to the humble. So just a principle there, when it comes to communication, you need to stay humble, right? You need to be humble enough to let that guard down in order to chat. And I always tell guys, you ought to let that guard down first. Don't expect a woman to let the guard down. You open up. And I think as you open up, I think females will start to feel more comfortable to open up. But if you're humble with one another and you're not proud, then you'll talk about these things and not think why is he bringing this up? Nobody asked me these things. It's none of your business. Well, if you're going to get married, it is his business. You know what I mean? So you can't have that frame of mind that it's none of your business when it is. So talk about those things. Last issue on this point is, what about marriage counseling? It's a big thing in churches where people say, what about if I'm going to get married, do I need to book an appointment with Victor and go through 6-7 weeks of marriage counseling and fill out these things? Well, no, we don't have formal marriage counseling, but my thoughts on marriage counseling is, it's not compulsory, but it is a good idea, right? It's a good idea to get some counsel. And, we think of counseling like you're sitting on a chair, laid back, and people probing you with questions. No, counseling is just advice, isn't it? It's a good idea to get advice. If you're going to get married to somebody, you can ask people for advice. It's a good idea because emotions hinder good judgment, don't they? So when you're emotionally attached to this person, you're probably not in the best situation to make an unbiased judgment. So it's good to ask, what do people think? And you don't need to just ask me. You can ask anybody in this church. You're looking at this girl, what do you think? Do you think it's a good idea? Do you see any red flags? It doesn't need to be a formal course. It doesn't need to be, you see me every week for 6 weeks and here's some worksheets that you need to work through. And it's just, you need to work through them just to do them. It's, really when it comes to spirituality, the ball's in your court. These are things that you need to do because you can sit through that course, but if you're just doing it just to get married, are you going to get the benefit out of it that it's designed to have? So that's why it's about changing your perspective. It's not just checking these tick boxes and saying, I've done all this, therefore it's done. It's about doing what's best for God, doing what's best for you, for your spouse, and doing what's best for you. So it's not compulsory. It's a good idea. But I will say this, marriage counseling, it should be something that you really get before you're involved with somebody, right? You're not with somebody and dating them for years and years and years and years, and then it's like, okay, now I'm going to get marriage counseling because we're thinking about getting married. Because when you get that advice and it's like, hey brother, it's not a good idea because she's not even saved, are you going to heed the advice? Probably people in that situation are usually, no, maybe God has put me in their life to get them saved, and they start justifying and, when it's wrong. But, when you've been involved for so long, are you going to listen to the advice when it's given to you? That's why marriage counseling is something that you ought to do before. And this is why when I started this series, people are like, well, I'm married. Why are you preaching on dating on Sunday morning? Because, you may have to give this advice to somebody else. So when somebody comes to you and says, what should I do? Is this a good idea? You ought to know so that you can tell them before they're too emotionally involved. Because maybe by the time they come to me, they've already been dating for 2 or 3 years and they're going to listen to me. We need to catch it. We need to nip it in the bud. So that's my thoughts on marriage counseling. I think it's a good idea to get advice, definitely. Whether it needs to be formal or not, I don't necessarily think so. And you can talk to really anyone in church here. Anyone here I think will give you good advice as long as it comes from the Bible. And it really should be something that you do before you even really get too physically or emotionally attached. All right, last thing I just want to cover. And I'll just try and squeeze this in. So sorry if you're not used to sermons that go over an hour long. But 2 Corinthians 6. I just want to talk about prerequisites for marriage. What are things that I think if this is the case in that dating, then you should not get married? And I think the Bible's pretty clear on a couple of them. And the most obvious one is in 2 Corinthians 6, verse 14. It says here, Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness, and what communion hath light with darkness? And it goes on to talk about, these two, what are they doing together? I think it's very clear in the Bible that God does not want us yoking up. And yoking up does not just mean hanging around, because you might have some unsaved friends or whatever. But, this is like a partnership. They talk about the yoke on the two oxen pulling the cart. I mean, you're working together, you're very close, you're bound to one another. So these types of relationships should not exist between a believer and an unbeliever. Why? Because it's dangerous, because they're going to rub off on you. So I think the Bible is very clear. If the person you're dating is not saved, you cannot marry them. I don't necessarily mean that you cannot get to know them, because is it wrong to get to know somebody who's not saved for the purpose of trying to get them saved? No, because it's no different to like getting together with an unsaved friend, right? And trying to get them saved and preaching the gospel. I mean, as long as they're willing to catch up with you and keep talking about the Bible and are really interested in whether or not they should believe on Jesus Christ, yeah, keep meeting up with them, and get them saved, even if they don't end up getting married to you. So that's definitely the case. It was the case with me and Elizabeth. She was not saved when we met, and then she eventually got saved, and then we got married. So I don't think there's anything sinful about dating somebody for the purpose of preaching the gospel to them. You're really just soul winning. But the same danger is there, because obviously if you are dating somebody to give them the gospel, the same danger is there that the emotional and the physical side is going to move quicker than the philosophical side. And one of the most important ones is philosophically you're the same on salvation, because you can't even, it's a sin to marry her or marry him if you're not even saved. So when they don't get saved, are you going to break that relationship if you get along so well and all that sort of stuff? So that same danger is there that we have to be aware of. So definitely you cannot marry somebody that is not saved. So you need to either find somebody that is saved or get them saved before you marry them. 2 Corinthians 7:36, it says here, But if any man think that he behaveth himself uncomely toward his virgin, if she pass the flower of her age and need so require, let him do what he will, he sinneth not, let them marry. So I think another requirement is the woman obviously has to be of age, right? She has to be, have her period, right, and be a woman. So no prepubescent women, Muhammad, okay? So that she has to be past the flower of her age, I think is very clear. Now, I don't have the verse for this one, but then this, and I've covered this in the last couple of ones, but just the fact that, because a woman belongs to her father and she can't make a vow without her father, she needs her permission. So I think that is one of the requirements of marriage, is you need the father's permission in order to marry this woman, because he could technically veto that vow. And his permission may not be positive, it just means that he's not against it, right? Because if he allows that vow to pass, like we read in Numbers, then you are able to marry that woman. So that's the third requirement. You do need the father's permission. And some things I just want to mention on that point is you don't need an ex-boyfriend or girlfriend's permission, because they don't belong to that person. And we shouldn't expect that from our ex-boyfriends or ex-girlfriends. You know what I mean? I remember I was dating a girl once, and we dated for a couple of years, and then we broke up. And then this guy called me in order to ask whether it was all right for him to date her. And I was like, she doesn't belong to me. Like, of course you can. But I can imagine that a lot of people would expect that, wouldn't they? They'd expect that from their friend, wouldn't they? Like, if you were dating a girl and then your friend went and dated her, I personally don't think you should expect that. I mean, if you're good friends and you know it's going to hurt your friend, should you do that to love your friend? Yeah, I think, you probably should, if you know that it's something that your friend was going through. But I think from our side of the coin, because we can't change what other people do, we should not expect it, because that girl that you didn't work out with doesn't belong to you. So the guy that's going to go date doesn't need your permission, because you don't have nothing to do with it. And likewise with a girl, you don't need another girl's permission to date a guy, because they don't belong to them. And the question came up about the father's permission. When do you get the father's permission? Do you get the father's permission at the very beginning to even start dating the girl? Do you get the father's permission to be more serious? Do you only get the father's permission once you've decided to marry and now you're getting the father's permission to marry? I personally think you need the father's permission from the beginning, because technically, you can't even see his daughter if you don't have his permission, right? Because he could just tell his daughter that you're not going to see him. So when you formally ask, I think it's best as early as possible. But I think if you're clear in your intentions and the father knows, I'm dating this girl because I'm looking for a wife, his response will probably be different to, well, you're just hanging out with my daughter and I don't know who you are, I don't know what your intentions are. So when to get the father's permission? Technically, you need the father's permission from the get-go, because you need his permission to even see his daughter. If he's allowed his daughter to just hang out with whoever, then technically you have that permission there. But if you don't want him to veto your vow, it's probably best that you're very clear with him what your intentions are and what you want to do, so that he allows you to marry his daughter. Okay, so you have to have the father's permission. So saved, she's a woman past the flower of her age. You have the father's permission. Now, I think as well, Genesis 2. Oh wait, I think it was 2. Genesis 2:24. Just this verse, therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. So I believe, a man should be ready to leave father and mother in order to get married. So this would be one of my no-goes, to say, is the man ready to leave? Is the man ready to leave in order to start this new family? So the questions that come up is, should you be working? Should you have your own place? I personally think you should be working. I think you should be financially responsible for your family. It doesn't necessarily mean you live in your own house. Because I think the idea is, the Bible says, if any provide not for his own, even for they that are of his own house, he has denied the faith and is worse than an infidel. So I think the man has to be ready to provide both financially and be responsible for his family in order to get married, right? You can't be, just studying and you're still getting paid for and then you want to get married. You may not be living in a new place because, a lot of cultures, you can't afford a new house. They live with their parents and they live in separate rooms of the house or in granny flats and things like that. So that might be your arrangement. That is not necessary. But what I'm getting at is you realize that your responsibility as a man is to care for this new family. If your family is not provided for, it's your fault, and it's the man's responsibility. That's why it says a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife. So I think the man should be ready to leave father and mother. That's number 4. Number 5 is that they're not currently married. Obviously, if they're currently married, meaning that they have, and even if they've been divorced, this is what we have to be careful of, because if somebody has been divorced legally, but they didn't divorce lawfully, meaning a biblical divorce, then they're still married to that person, and you can't marry that person. Because if they're still married in the eyes of God, that's called adultery. That's no longer called marriage. So they have to not be currently married in the eyes of God. Number 6, we read in Leviticus 6, the different relational ties that are unlawful. Marrying your father, marrying your uncle and aunt, and these different relational ties that are unlawful. So obviously, if the relational tie is unlawful, then that's a no-go on marriage. Now, this might be controversial, but I do not believe that brother and sister is a sin to get married. I don't think it's wise, just because of the genetics behind it. But if you go back and listen to my sermons on marriage, I explain why I don't believe it can be a sin. And the short answer is because obviously Cain and Abel had to marry their sister, and if it was a sin, how could God put them in a situation to sin? So I believe that's why it's not given the death sentence. But if you read in Leviticus 20, you'll see the different relational ties that are sinful and are not lawful. Now beyond those 6, so that was that. Saved, female past the flower age, father's permission, man ready to leave father and mother, not currently married, and the relational tie is lawful. I might have missed some. If I missed some, just let me know afterwards. But see, beyond those, I really think it's just a matter of choice, and it's a matter of wisdom, right? Beyond those things, because people will generally ask questions about these things to determine, is this person okay for me to marry. And what are these things that are beyond those? One might be their spiritual maturity. You know, how mature do they need to be before it's a no-go zone? I don't know whether there is a right and wrong answer to that. You know, for me, I think it's wise that you find somebody that's heading in the same direction. You know, they may be spiritually younger, but if you're heading in the same direction, then I think you'll have a successful relationship. You know, what about looks? You know, it's not wrong to desire somebody that you're attracted to. I do definitely think in the grand scheme of things, it's vain because, you know, come 20 or 30 years, they're not going to be as attractive as you first met them. That's just the reality of it. And for those of us who are married, we know, you know, even if you married a really beautiful woman, which I believe I did, you know, is she as attractive as I felt she was the day we met? Of course not. You know, she knows that too. I mean, it's just realistic. But that's not what's binding our relationship together. You know, it's not wrong to marry somebody that you're attracted to, but it shouldn't be the highest on your list. Because it is vain. Because when 20, 30 years go past, I mean, they're not, after they have a couple of kids even, they're not going to be the same shape as they were when you first met them. And you know, most girls, if they were just healthy, you know, they'd be attractive. You know, most girls, if they were just healthy and just looked after themselves, it's not about, you know, what's the latest thing, like CrossFit? You know, it doesn't have to be some CrossFit girl that can like do like 100 sit-ups and 100 bench presses or whatever. You know, I don't think that's what it takes just to be healthy and attractive for a lady. It just means just eating right. You know, and eating right doesn't mean, you know, you work an 8-hour shift and you eat nothing for breakfast and then for lunch you have like a cracker with a slice of cheese and a slice of tomato on it. And then you have like nothing until dinner, and dinner, I don't know what girls have for dinner, like a can of tuna or something like that. I mean, that's not healthy. You know, I see people at work eating like that. I'm just thinking, you know, this is why you're struggling to lose weight, because you're starving your body, and your body's like packing on all this fat because it thinks it's going to die. You know, that's how the body works. So you can look it up. You know, if you starve your body goes into starvation mode, and then when you eat things, it now starts storing fat rather than feeding the muscle and using up the fat because it thinks you're starved. That's why people know if you want to keep your metabolism up, you need to eat at regular intervals because it keeps your metabolism going. And what you eat is going to be important too. You know, if you're just eating sugar, you know, you starve yourself and then you have cake and donuts at work, I mean, that's going to make you put on weight, you know, because you're just not looking after your health. So healthy does not mean eat nothing at all, except for the, you know, I say the Cruskets with the cheese, and I just don't know how they do that. I see the girls at work and they prepare their lunch and they get out 2 pieces of Cruskets and they slice their cheese into it. And that's all they have, all they have a noodle cup. And I'm just like, how can you eat a noodle cup for lunch? It's like the worst lunch ever. And like, how does that even fill you up? I don't know. It's like flour in water, flavored water. So, you know, looks, that's one. Purity. You know, like I said, it's not a requirement. I do think it's important if you're giving the pretense that you're pure and you're not. But, you know, is it important that somebody is pure or not? You know, for you it might be important, for others it might not be important. For me it wasn't that big a deal, you know. So purity, it's not a requirement. It's just a loss of a blessing, obviously, because fornication, you know, because fornication is not the death penalty. You know, fornication in the Bible, if you fornicate with a girl, you should just be forced to marry her. If your father doesn't want to give her in marriage, then you need to pay the dowry, pay the penalty. So it's not the death penalty, so it's not a no-go zone if somebody is impure, right? It's just a loss of a blessing. So purity, what have we got? Spiritual maturity, looks, purity. Some other examples: how responsible are they? How financially stable they are. You know, what's your financial stability? And obviously, this is subjective, isn't it? And is there any even such thing as financial stability? Because you could marry the guy that has all the money in the world and then he gets sick and loses it all. Is that what you're basing your decision on? So I don't know if that's important. I think it's more so responsibility. You know, does he realize that he's responsible for taking care of the finances of the house? You know, different interests. You might, you know, want the same interests. Personality, ethnicity and culture, life skills, experience. I will say this though, when it comes to things that are beyond the no-go zones, is, you know, don't be a hypocrite with your criteria. You know what I mean? Like, if you want a pure girl and you're not pure, I mean, you're a bit of a hypocrite, right? To say, well, I want a virgin, but I'm not even a virgin. You know, I want a girl that has never liked anyone before, but yet I've liked other people before. I mean, this is a bit hypocritical, isn't it? And, you know, be graceful. You know, because you might want this perfect person, this perfect virgin or whatever, but does it matter? You know, I mean, Christ forgave them. Christ loves them the way they are and accepted them and wants to help them. So, do you want somebody that's just like ready-made, or do you want to take somebody that's imperfect and make them better? So be graceful and have that Christ-like spirit when it comes to who you choose to marry. They don't need to be perfect. If you want somebody that's perfect, it's not necessarily wrong to desire things above what are the no-go zones. But, just ask yourself, is what level are you going to take it to, and is it important? So the last two questions I just want to address is, generally when it comes to dating, and I want to end on this question. There's two questions I have, but one question is, how do I know I've chosen the person according to God's will? That's generally the question that people ask. Young people ask that. Like, how do I know this is God's will for me, this person? And really, what we've covered in this series is, I hope you've realized, well, it's because it's a choice, right? And we have now here the guidelines of what the boundaries in which God allows us to choose. So if they meet the no-go zones, which is, they're saved, past flower, the things that I covered, then really it's your choice. So within those bounds of marriage, any girl within those boundaries, it's God's will for you. As opposed to thinking that there is one girl that is God's will for you and you are trying to find that one girl, you need to realize that the situation is we're given boundaries and all the girls within that boundary are God's will for you. It's just which one do you want to marry? So when I married Elizabeth, I knew it was God's will for me because she met the no-go zones and I wanted to marry her. So you see how I know that it's God's will for me to marry this girl? Because I know what God does not want me to marry. Elizabeth fits within those criteria and I wanted to marry her. So that's God's will. And this is how you can have assurance. Because when I was a young person, that's always the question that boggled my mind is, how do I know that this is the girl that God wants me to marry? But when I realized it was a choice I had to make within the boundaries that God had given me, then I had that assurance that when I married her, I was doing what God wanted me to do because I knew what God expected from me. So I just share my story real quickly, but when I was single when I went to Arizona, and that's what I went to visit Faithful Word Baptist Church. And it was funny because when we went there were no girls in the church, right? It was just all young guys and married people. And I wasn't really concerned with finding a wife while I was there because I knew eventually I'd come back to Australia. But there were other guys that wanted to find wives. So we were thinking, how are we going to meet other girls? So some of the guys in the church that I used to hang out with would say, hey, why don't we just go to the mall and just like chat up some girls? And to me, that, because maybe the culture that I come from, that was like, whoa, that was way like too daunting. Like just chatting up like just a random stranger and then getting a number and talking. Because I guess from what my background is, you always know them, or you know somebody that knew them. So everybody I know that's married somebody has married somebody that knew somebody and was introduced to them, or that you met them through a circle, not just like picking up some random person. So we got together. And we were like, okay, let's go to the mall. So we went to the mall that was nearby. It was Arizona Mills Mall. So it's kind of like going to Roselands, right? And they're like, hey, why don't we'll go to the food court, we'll get a drink so it doesn't just look like we're hanging out there doing nothing. Get a drink and we'll start like scoping out like, which girls to approach. So I don't know how much to tell you about. I'll just tell you the funny details. But it's funny because it was there, one of the guys we were with there, he was really bold. Like we would be like, hey, like there's a girl that's pretty cute, and he's like, okay, I'm going for it. So he'll go for it, and he'll be talking to her, and we were like watching the conversation, and then partway through the conversation, a gospel track comes out, and we're like, no, like don't give her the gospel now. Like just get to know her first. We're like it's going downhill from there. So then he comes back, and it's like, how did I say no? I didn't go that well. He's like, but I gave her the gospel. So we were doing that a couple of times, and we were about to leave, and Elizabeth actually worked in the food court in the merry-go-round. So in the food court in Arizona Mills Mall, there was like a huge carousel, merry-go-round, and Elizabeth actually worked at that merry-go-round, just letting the kids in and letting them off. So we're about to leave, and then she's working there at the merry-go-round, and Matthew Stuckey, he's sort of like, go over and talk to her, because I was like, hey, that girl's kind of cute. He's like, go over and talk to her. I'm like, no. He's like, so he's sort of egging me on, right, and telling me to go talk to her. So I said, okay. So I just forced myself, and then I went over. I don't know if she remembers this, but going over with a huge grin on my face and just trying to think of what questions to ask her to get this conversation going. But thank God I was successful. I got a number, invite her along to bowling, because we basically planned this bowling event in order to invite girls that we had met to sort of take them bowling, right? So brought her along to bowling, and we had a couple of other dates. The second day we had is I took her out for ice cream, and then at ice cream, because we were by ourselves, I gave her the gospel. That was the first time. And she didn't actually receive it that well. She was just like, oh, okay, well, that's interesting. She doesn't know if she believes that. So it was kind of a bit awkward afterwards. And it was like, well, even if we don't get together, I still want you to be saved. So when I dropped her off at home, I was just like, hey, well, do you still want to meet up and get to know one another? And she was like, yeah. So I was like, oh, cool. So we made another appointment and got together. And because I worked at an electronics store that was right next to that shopping center. So then I was picking her up after work and taking her home after work. So from that day onwards, after that day we had ice cream, we were seeing each other every day. So every day when we met up, we would go out, maybe get something to eat, and in the car and at dinner and on the way home. What do you think we were talking about? The Bible. Talking about the gospel, and because she came from a Mormon family, so I was giving her the gospel week after week day after day after day, not week after week, but day after day after day. And I just remember every time dropping her off at home, before she got out of the car and went into the house, I'd always ask her, so is tonight, are you ready to ask Jesus to save you? So that went on for about 2 weeks, where I was giving Elizabeth the gospel, and eventually one night she said, yeah, because the night before, she was saying, okay, I'll ask him to save me, like myself though. And then when I'd ask her the next night, she's like, no, she hasn't done it yet. So the night finally came about 2 weeks later, where she said, yeah, I'm ready to get saved. So then we prayed together in the car, and that's when we started working towards marriage. So after that, after she got saved, right, she'd never come to church yet. So I wanted her to come to church, and I wanted her to come soul winning, because I wanted her to see what my life was like. So after she got saved, throughout those 2 weeks, we had been talking about all the things that I talked to you about today, talking about life, family, kids, all sorts of things. The only thing she hadn't experienced yet was church, the church that I went to. And I took her to Faithful Word. Well, actually, before she came to church, she came soul winning with me, because on the Saturday, there was those small town soul winning marathons, and I had to work in the morning, and I wanted to go for the afternoon. So then we picked up Elizabeth and picked up a couple of other guys, and then we went out to the small town and went soul winning for the rest of the afternoon, from about 1 to about 6 o'clock. And Elizabeth came with me. So I took her soul winning, and we went soul winning for a couple of hours, and she really enjoyed it. And even you remember Stephen Anderson asking you, like, what did you think of soul winning? And she's like, yeah, I can see how it's hard work, but I can see how it's worth it. And I'm like, ding, ding, that's good. That's a good reaction to soul winning. So then after she came soul winning, then the Sunday was the first time she ever came to Faithful Word Baptist Church. And Stephen Anderson preached on adultery and fornication, and he was just like, so I was thinking, like, so what did you think of that? What did you think of this? She was like, she loved it. She thought it was really interesting and engaging, and like she could see that his personality was like that, but it was expected because of the topic that he was preaching on. So it was actually that Sunday night that I took her home after the evening church meeting. And I took her home and I said, I don't know if these were the exact words that I said. But before I get to that, see, there was actually a time where it almost didn't work out. Because remember, I gave her the gospel at the beginning, and it was kind of edgy there, but then we started to get to know one another. And about a week in, Elizabeth was having second thoughts. Like, 'cause I remember we were at a park once and we were talking, and she basically said to me, you know what? No, I'm not willing to believe, I'm not willing to change. This is not going to work out. So that was kind of a bit heartbreaking on that night. But I don't know what I said or how I saved it. But for some reason, we kept still seeing each other, and we eventually got married. So there was almost a fork in the road where it didn't work out. So after those 2 weeks, she came soul winning with me. She came to church, and then that night, I pretty much said something like this to her. I said, you know what my life is like. I work, I go to church, I go soul winning. This is what my life is like. And if you want to be a part of it, I'll marry you. I'll take you back to Australia, and we'll get married. And that's pretty much how I proposed, about 2 weeks or 3 weeks, I can't remember the exact date, after we met. And she had to think about it for a bit. She went and spoke with her family and discussed, and about a week later, she said, yeah, let's do it. So then we started to plan the wedding, plan how we were going to get back to Australia, and then we got married about 2 months, about a month and a half later after we met. Now I share you this story just to explain to you, because when I did that, I already knew going into that relationship what I believe today, what I'm teaching you today, what I was looking for. So I was looking for a girl that obviously was saved, that knew what I wanted to do in life, because I had already had a goal to serve the Lord Jesus and to start a church one day. So I already knew where I was heading, and I knew what I was looking for. And I was looking for a girl, I was attracted to and wanted to be a part of that. So when I found it, I could make that decision, right? So, one of the things I said to Elizabeth, I remember, I don't know if Elizabeth remembers this. I said, I don't know, I can't promise you what our life is going to be like, but I can promise you that if you marry me, you will serve God with your life. Because I knew that I would serve God with my life, and I knew whichever girl I would marry, I would take along for the ride. So the point I was trying to make is, people often said to me, like, how did you make a decision so quickly? Because it boggles their mind, saying, like, how did you decide to marry this girl in 2 weeks, in 3 weeks? Well, it's because of what I explained to you guys over the last couple of weeks. If you talk about these things, it doesn't take long to get to know somebody. Especially if every time you meet, you're talking about things that matter. Oftentimes people date, they get together, they talk about things that don't matter. Talk about things that matter, talk about your future together. You'll get to know somebody really quick, because, either it'll be a bit too much for them, or they'll start to open up and you'll start to get to know them. And if you spend enough time with somebody, they can't hide who they really are, So if you talk about these things, you get to know them, you know what the boundaries are that God has set for you. And if you want to marry that person, then you know that's God's will. And it doesn't take years and years to years to make that decision. So how did I choose so quickly? That's how it worked out, and just using these principles that I'm teaching you today in the last couple of weeks. Now, the last question I just want to cover is it possible to marry the wrong person? Because people will say, well, what if I marry the wrong person? Should I break up that marriage, or is it possible to marry the wrong person? Now, we've seen some guidelines of who is the right and wrong person to marry. Because if you marry, let's just use the example of an unbeliever. If you marry an unbeliever, have you married the wrong person? Yes, you did marry the wrong person, because you sinned in order to marry that person, right? Because you married an unbeliever. But the interesting thing is once you marry that person, they are now the right person to stay married to. So it's not that now you're married to the wrong person. You did the wrong thing marrying that person, and they weren't the right person. But now that you're married, the commandment is different, isn't it? Because it says, don't be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. So you've sinned going into the relationship, but now that you've made that vow, you would sin breaking that vow. You would sin divorcing or putting them away and marrying another because you'd commit adultery. So the right thing now, the right person now, is the person you're married to. So I hope that makes sense. So you can marry the wrong person, obviously, because if you sin and go against what God says, you've married the wrong person. But once you're married, they are now the right person. So the reason why I wouldn't say you can't marry the wrong person because they're the right person, because the ends doesn't justify the means. Just because they are now the right person, you can't say, well, I can marry anyone then, because once I marry them, they're the right person. No, because you are still sinning in order to get there, and you should never sin. So I hope that answers that question. I hope that's interesting. Okay, well, if you have any questions, maybe you can ask me afterwards, just for sake of time. But I hope the series was interesting for you, and you've learned a lot. If you've missed some of them, just go back and listen to them. They're all online. All right, let's pray.